The rain arrived at precisely the moment the musicians struck their first chord, a soft percussion against the tall windows of Ashworth House that whispered of autumn's inevitable approach, of seasons turning whether one wished them to or not. Inside, the ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, their golden light reflecting off crystal chandeliers and the jewels adorning throats and wrists and elaborate coiffures, casting everything in that peculiar glow that made youth appear even more luminous and everything else simply older. Miss Eleanor Hartley stood near the third column from the eastern wall, her customary position, acquired through 9 seasons of practice, where the light fell just softly enough to be kind without drawing attention, where the music reached her ears without requiring her to witness too closely the whirl of dancing couples, where she could observe without being observed, or so she told herself in those moments when self-deception seemed the kindest course. 27 years old, 9 seasons endured, and she had become what the matrons called with false sympathy and the debutantes called with barely concealed triumph, a shelf-sitter, an ape-leader, that most pitiable of creatures, an old maid. The words no longer stung as they once had. She had developed that peculiar armor that comes from repeated wounding, a scar tissue of the soul that felt nothing because it had felt everything. Her gown was dove-grey silk, elegant in its simplicity, expensive in its fabric, but restrained in its adornment. No flounces, no excessive lace, no ribbons in shades that suggested she was still competing with the 18-year-old girls in their pastel confections of pink and yellow and the palest blue. She had learned, slowly and painfully, that there was dignity in accepting one's position rather than fighting it with increasingly desperate stratagems, and that grace could be found in standing still while others danced, that a woman might build a life of meaning even when society deemed her superfluous to its primary purpose of marriage and childbearing. The younger girls, for she could not help but think of them as girls, though some were merely 7 or 8 years her junior, clustered near the center of the room like exotic birds, their laughter pitched to carry, their fans fluttering with practiced coquetry, their eyes calculating the worth of every gentleman who entered, while their lips curved in smiles that promised nothing and everything. She heard their whispers sometimes, or rather, she heard the whispers they intended her to hear. 9 seasons, can you imagine? And such a shame, though of course at her age. And Mama says it's because she has no conversation, too bookish by half. Eleanor's gloved fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against her own fan, the only outward sign of the small, sharp pain that still managed to find the gaps in her armor. But her face remained serene, her posture perfect, her expression one of mild, polite interest in nothing in particular. Outside, the rain continued its gentle assault upon the windows, each drop a small defeat, each rivulet a tear the night wept for all the women who stood at the periphery of life's grand ball, watching and waiting and slowly learning not to hope. The Duke of Thorncliffe arrived without fanfare, yet the effect of his entrance was as dramatic as if trumpets had heralded his appearance, the very air in the ballroom seeming to shift and thicken with collective anticipation, conversations faltering mid-sentence, fans freezing mid-flutter, every eye turning toward the tall figure who paused at the top of the shallow stairs that led down into the glittering assembly. Julian Ashford possessed that particular quality of presence that had nothing to do with his title and everything to do with the man himself, broad-shouldered and lean. His evening clothes cut with such precision they might have been painted onto his frame, his dark hair silvered at the temples in a way that added gravitas rather than age, his features arranged in an expression of such perfect courtesy that it became its own form of armor, revealing nothing, permitting no intimacy. Eleanor watched from her distant column as the matchmaking mamas drew breath like generals preparing for battle, as the debutantes straightened their postures and brightened their smiles and angled themselves for optimal viewing, as the other gentleman seemed to diminish slightly in his shadow, and she felt an unexpected sympathy for this man she had never met, this duke who had buried his wife 3 years prior and fled to the continent, who was rumored to be impossible to please, cold as January, wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice, and therefore the season's most coveted prize. His reputation preceded him in whispers that had circulated for weeks before his return. He had married once for duty to a baron's daughter of impeccable lineage and insufficient warmth, had produced an heir and a spare before his duchess succumbed to fever, had mourned with appropriate dignity before departing England's shores, and now, at 36, was presumably in want of a wife, though his demeanor suggested a man who wanted nothing whatsoever, except perhaps to be left alone. The debutantes formed their predatory circle with remarkable swiftness, a pastel noose of matrimonial ambition, each young woman vying for position while maintaining the fiction of disinterest, their laughter becoming more melodious, their gestures more graceful, their eyes more luminous, with hope and calculation in equal measure. Eleanor observed this theatre with the detachment of one who had long ago resigned from the performance, noting the desperation beneath the artifice, the way youth and beauty could be wielded like weapons, yet offered no guarantee of victory, and she found herself hoping, in a distant sort of way, that whichever girl won this particular prize would be kind to him, would see past the title to the man who looked so terribly weary behind his impeccable manners. Lord Ashworth approached the Duke with effusive welcome, leading him deeper into the room, and it was then, in that moment of transition, that Julian Ashford's gaze swept across the ballroom in what appeared to be casual survey, but was perhaps instead an assessment of escape routes, and his eyes met Eleanor's across the expanse of polished floor and swirling couples and strategic matrimonial positioning. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps less, yet in that brief intersection of glances, something passed between them, recognition, though they had never met, understanding, though no words were spoken, a peculiar jolt of connection that Eleanor felt in the precise center of her chest, like the striking of a match in darkness. His eyes were grey, she noted with the clarity that sometimes accompanies shock, grey as winter dawn, grey as the gown she wore, grey as the rain still falling against the windows, and in them she saw what she suspected he saw in hers: exhaustion, resignation, the weight of social performance, the cost of maintaining dignity when one would prefer to simply leave. Then his attention was claimed by Lady Ashworth, and the moment broke, and Eleanor told herself it had meant nothing, was nothing, would lead to nothing. Even as something in her chest continued to flutter like a candle flame in an uncertain draught, even as she pressed one hand against her bodice to still that foolish, a fragile stirring of something she had learned long ago not to name. Eleanor had perhaps 30 seconds warning before he reached her column, 30 seconds in which to observe the Duke of Thorncliffe navigate the ballroom with polite determination, deflecting Lady Ashworth's attempt to introduce him to a cluster of debutantes with a murmured excuse, stepping around Lord Pemberton's eldest daughter with courteous efficiency, and his trajectory unmistakable in its destination. And in those 30 seconds, her heart performed a complicated series of gymnastics that she had thought herself far too sensible to experience, a hope and terror warring in her chest, while her mind insisted this could not possibly be happening, that he must be approaching someone behind her, that she had misread the situation entirely. But then he stood before her, tall and somehow more real than he had seemed from across the room, and executed a bow of such perfect formality that it might have been mocking, except for something in those winter-grey eyes that suggested he found the entire performance as exhausting as she did, and his voice when he spoke carried the cultured tones of his class, but with an underlying weariness that spoke to her own. "Miss Hartley, I believe, would you do me the honor of this dance?" The ballroom did not literally fall silent. The musicians continued their waltz. Conversations carried on. Couples still turned across the floor, yet Eleanor felt the quality of attention shift, felt the weight of 100 gazes suddenly fixed upon her, with varying degrees of shock and calculation, and, from the direction of the debutantes, something approaching fury. Her training, those endless lessons in deportment that her mother had insisted upon season after season, came to her rescue when her voice might have failed. "Your Grace, I would be honored," she replied, her tone level despite the chaos of her pulse, and she placed her gloved hand in his with the careful dignity of one who had long ago learned that grace was sometimes the only currency left to those whom fortune had overlooked. He led her onto the floor with practiced ease, one hand settling at her waist with appropriate lightness, the other holding hers with a firmness that suggested competence rather than intimacy, and as they began to move, she found herself grateful for the countless dances of her youth, the muscle memory that allowed her body to follow his lead, while her mind struggled to comprehend what was transpiring, why the most sought-after gentleman of the season had chosen her over the beautiful girls, who watched with expressions ranging from bewilderment to barely concealed rage. "You are wondering why I asked you to dance," he said after they had completed half a turn, his observation delivered with the directness of one who had exhausted his patience for social pretense, and Eleanor found herself responding with equal honesty before she could think better of it. "I am wondering when you will realize your mistake and return me to my column, Your Grace." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or approval, and when he spoke again, his voice held the faintest trace of amusement. "I rarely make mistakes, Miss Hartley, and when I do, I certainly do not compound them by continuing the error through an entire waltz." She felt her own lips curve slightly, helplessly, at the dry wit in his tone, and emboldened by his directness ventured, "Then you have some purpose in selecting the oldest and least sought-after woman in the room. Forgive me, but it seems a curious strategy if your aim is to satisfy the matchmaking mamas." "My aim," he replied, guiding her through a turn with such skill she barely noticed the movement, "is to enjoy a dance with someone who might engage in actual conversation rather than simpering platitudes about the weather, and you, Miss Hartley, can strike me as a woman of intelligence who has perhaps grown as weary of this performance as I have." They danced in silence for a moment, and Eleanor felt something dangerous unfurl in her chest, that treacherous thing called hope that she had spent years learning to suppress, even as her mind warned her that this was likely nothing more than a duke's whim, a momentary rebellion against the prescribed order of things. Yet when she met his eyes, she saw in them not pity or condescension, but something far more unsettling, genuine interest, as though he saw her not as a failure of the marriage market, but as a person worthy of his attention. And she understood in that moment that whatever happened next, this dance had already altered something fundamental, and had cracked the careful armor she had built around her heart, leaving her vulnerable once again to the very pain she had learned to avoid. The morning after the Ashworth ball dawned grey and unremarkable, yet by the time Eleanor descended for breakfast, the world had somehow shifted on its axis. This shift made evident by the fact that her mother's drawing room, typically quiet during morning hours, was filled with no fewer than 7 callers by 11 o'clock, each of whom had ostensibly come to discuss the previous evening's entertainment, but whose true purpose revealed itself in their carefully barbed observations and sweetly venomous inquiries. Lady Cordelia Fairfax, acknowledged beauty of the season, with her golden ringlets and porcelain complexion, and eyes of such startling blue they seemed to demand admiration, led the assault with the precision of a general who had planned her campaign in advance, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that was far more cutting than outright insult. "Dear Miss Hartley, how very unusual that the Duke singled you out for attention. One cannot help but wonder what stratagem you employed to capture his notice, though of course we all know you have such depths of experience in these matters, having attended so many seasons." The other young ladies tittered behind their fans while their mammas maintained expressions of polite interest that fooled no one, and Eleanor felt the familiar weight of social judgment settle across her shoulders like a cloak she had worn too many years, though she kept her own expression serene and her voice level as she replied, "I employed no stratagem whatsoever, Lady Cordelia, unless you count standing quietly in one's assigned location as tactical maneuvering." The barbs continued throughout the interminable visit observations about how desperate gentlemen sometimes made curious choices, speculation about whether the Duke had perhaps confused her for someone else in the candlelight, pointed questions about whether she had perhaps reminded him of some elderly relative of whom he was fond. And through it all, Eleanor maintained the dignity that had become her shield and her prison, that careful composure that revealed nothing of the turmoil within, the dangerous flutter of hope she was desperately trying to suppress before it could take root and bloom into something that would inevitably wither. Her younger sister, Margaret, 19 and in her second season, possessed neither Eleanor's patience nor her practiced restraint, and when the callers finally departed, she rounded on Eleanor with indignation blazing in her dark eyes. "How can you simply sit there and allow them to speak to you so abominably? You should have cut them all, and should have ordered them from our drawing room. Should have." But Eleanor silenced her with a gentle hand and a sad smile, saying only, "They speak from fear, dearest. Fear that what they have staked their entire worth upon, youth and beauty and novelty, might prove less valuable than they have been taught to believe, and one cannot truly blame them for their terror, even as one must endure its consequences. Their mother hovered between hope and caution, her hands twisting in her lap as she ventured, "But surely the Duke's attention must mean something. Eleanor, surely he would not have singled you out without some degree of interest." Yet Eleanor could not bear to see hope kindle in her mother's eyes when she had learned too well the pain of its extinguishing, and so she murmured something non-committal and retreated to her father's library, that sanctuary of leather-bound volumes and afternoon light, where she had spent so many hours of her 9 unsuccessful seasons, managing the household accounts her father's failing eyesight made difficult for him, reading philosophy and poetry, constructing a life of purpose beyond the marriage market that had so thoroughly rejected her. She had perhaps an hour of peace before their housekeeper appeared with a package that had just been delivered, and Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the brown paper to reveal an arrangement of white roses, not the overblown hothouse blooms that spoke of vulgar expense, but delicate garden roses that suggested thoughtfulness and restraint, accompanied by a card that bore only the Duke of Thorncliffe's crest and a single line in elegant script. "Thank you for the most genuine conversation I have enjoyed in 3 years." And though Eleanor knew she should guard her heart, should recognize this might be merely a polite acknowledgement rather than a declaration of interest, she could not prevent the warmth that bloomed in her chest, even as she heard through the open window the whispers of passers-by who had undoubtedly witnessed the delivery and were already adding this detail to the growing mythology of the old maid, who had somehow, impossibly, captured a duke's attention. Eleanor had not intended to visit Hatchard's that particular Thursday afternoon, but her father had requested a specific volume on agricultural reform, and Margaret had needed an excuse to escape their mother's fretting about the Duke's continued silence in the 3 days since the flowers had arrived, and so the sisters found themselves among the crowded shelves of London's most fashionable lending library, where the scent of leather and paper and possibility hung in the air like incense. And it was there, in the philosophy section, where few young ladies of the ton ever ventured, that Eleanor rounded a corner with her arms full of books and nearly collided with Julian Ashford, Duke of Thorncliffe, who appeared equally surprised by the encounter, and yet also, and this she noticed with a flutter of something dangerous in her chest, genuinely pleased to see her, his winter-grey eyes warming with an expression that suggested her presence was a gift rather than an inconvenience. "Miss Hartley," he said, steadying the books she had nearly dropped, with reflexes that spoke of genuine concern rather than mere politeness, "I had not thought to find anyone else in this particular corner of the establishment. Most callers prefer the novels or poetry, I find, rather than Aristotle's Ethics," and she could not help her smile as she replied, "I have always found that novels, while diverting, rarely provide practical guidance for the actual business of living. Your Grace, whereas the philosophers at least attempt to grapple with existence as it truly is, rather than as we might wish it to be." They spoke then with an ease that had been impossible in the ballroom's artificial atmosphere, their conversation flowing from philosophy to poetry to the recent publication of Lord Byron's latest work, which Julian admitted he found overwrought, while Eleanor defended its emotional honesty, and she watched something extraordinary happen to his face as they debated the careful ducal mask slipping to reveal genuine animation, a spark of intellectual engagement that transformed his austere features into something approaching warmth. And when he smiled, truly smiled, she felt her carefully constructed defenses tremble like a wall undermined by persistent water, slow erosion that would eventually lead to collapse. Margaret, who had been browsing in the poetry section with instructions to allow Eleanor privacy, watched from a distance with barely suppressed delight as the Duke and her sister talked with complete absorption, time passing unmarked until the library's proprietor discreetly reminded them of the approaching closing hour, and it was only then that Julian seemed to recall the world beyond their conversation, glancing toward the windows where afternoon light had shifted to early evening's gold, and he said with what seemed like genuine regret, "I have kept you far too long, Miss Hartley. Your family will wonder at your delay." But Eleanor, emboldened by the intimacy of shared ideas, replied softly, "Some delays are worth the wondering, Your Grace." He looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she saw in his expression something she had not dared hope for, not mere attraction or casual interest, but recognition, as though he had discovered in her something essential that he had not known he was seeking, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of vulnerability that she suspected he rarely revealed. My wife, my late wife, was a good woman, but we shared little beyond our duties and our name, and I have spent 3 years believing that such emptiness was the natural state of matrimonial arrangements. Yet, speaking with you, I find myself wondering if perhaps I had simply not met someone who saw beyond the title to the man beneath. And Eleanor, whose heart was now beating with such force she was certain he must hear it, responded with careful honesty, "I think, Your Grace, that you might be the first person in 9 seasons who has spoken to me as though my thoughts mattered more than my marriageability, and I confess I find it both deeply unsettling and remarkably pleasant." They walked afterward through the small garden adjacent to the library, Margaret trailing at a respectful distance, as propriety demanded, and the autumn leaves that drifted from the trees seemed to Eleanor like a benediction, nature's acknowledgement of transformation and change, the necessary death of what had been to make room for what might yet be, and though neither of them spoke of it directly, both understood that something significant had shifted between them, that the possibility of genuine connection had taken root despite all the reasons why it should not, despite the difference in their stations and the gossip that would inevitably follow, despite her age and his grief and the 100 obstacles that society would place in their path, or perhaps, Eleanor thought, as she watched a leaf spiral downward in the golden light, precisely because of those obstacles, because they had both learned that what came easily was rarely what endured, and that the most precious things were often those one had stopped hoping to find. Lady Cordelia Fairfax had not achieved her position as the season's acknowledged diamond through beauty alone, though her golden loveliness certainly provided advantageous weaponry, no. She had risen to prominence through strategic calculation and an instinct for social warfare that would have impressed Wellington himself, and in the week following the Duke's library encounter with Eleanor Hartley, she marshalled her considerable forces with the precision of a general preparing for decisive battle, beginning with what appeared to be an unfortunate accident at Lady Pemberton's afternoon musicale, when Eleanor, arriving with Margaret and taking her customary seat near the back of the drawing-room, found her path to her chair suddenly obstructed by Cordelia's elaborately flounced skirts, resulting in Eleanor's stumbling directly into a footman carrying a tray of punch, the crimson liquid splashing across Eleanor's modest blue gown, while Cordelia's voice rang out with false concern. "Oh, how dreadfully clumsy, though I suppose at a certain age one's balance becomes unreliable, does it not?" The other young ladies tittered dutifully, while their mammas maintained expressions of sympathetic dismay that fooled no one, and Eleanor felt the familiar burn of humiliation even as she maintained her composure, accepting the hostess's flustered apologies and Margaret's furious whispered offers to leave immediately. But Eleanor refused to grant them the satisfaction of retreat, instead sitting through the entire performance in her stained gown, with her head high and her expression serene. Though her hands trembled slightly in her lap, where no one could observe them, the assault continued over the following days with escalating boldness, loud conversations in Eleanor's vicinity about how tragic it was when spinsters grew desperate enough to employ stratagems to capture gentlemen's attention, speculation about what arts of manipulation she must possess to bewitch a duke, pointed observations about her advanced age and plain features, and presumption in imagining herself suitable for a man of Thorncliffe's consequence. And through it all, Eleanor maintained the dignity that had become both her shield, her burden, responding to cruelty with courtesy, meeting malice with grace, though Margaret's anger on her behalf grew daily more volatile, and their mother fretted endlessly about whether they should withdraw from society until the gossip subsided. It was at the Hendersons' evening musicale, nearly a fortnight after the library encounter, that Julian Ashford appeared unexpectedly, despite having sent regrets, and Eleanor felt her breath catch when she saw him enter the crowded drawing-room, his presence commanding immediate attention as conversations faltered and every unmarried lady straightened in her chair. But his grey eyes swept the room with clear purpose until they found Eleanor seated in her customary location at the periphery, and without acknowledging any of the eager young women, whose fans fluttered like desperate birds, he crossed directly to her, bowed with precise formality, and said in a voice pitched to carry across the suddenly silent room, "Miss Hartley, I wonder if I might impose upon you to sit beside me during the performance. I find that music is infinitely more enjoyable when one's companion possesses the intelligence to discuss its merits afterward, rather than simply sighing, dramatically at appropriate intervals. Eleanor saw Lady Cordelia's face flush with fury and heard the collective intake of breath from the assembled company. But more importantly, she saw in Julian's eyes a quiet anger that suggested he had observed far more of the social campaign against her than she had realized. And when she placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her to seats of prominence near the front of the room, she felt the delicate balance of power shift perceptibly, the whispers now uncertain rather than malicious, the calculations being hastily revised. And as the music began, and Julian leaned close to murmur some observation about the performer's technique, Eleanor recognized with a shiver of prescience that Lady Cordelia's desperation would now escalate beyond mere social cruelty into something more dangerous, that a woman accustomed to victory would not accept defeat gracefully, and that whatever was coming would test not only Eleanor's dignity, but the still fragile connection between herself and the Duke, whose interest had transformed her from invisible to target, from overlooked to threatened, from safe in her obscurity to vulnerable in her emerging hope. The Duke of Thorncliffe arrived at the Hartley residence on a Tuesday afternoon, when the light slanted golden through the drawing-room windows, and Mrs. Hartley had worked herself into such a state of anxious preparation that she had rearranged the flowers 3 times and consulted with cook twice about the proper cakes to serve a duke, while Mr. Hartley maintained an expression of cautious reserve that suggested he would observe carefully before rendering judgment, and Eleanor herself felt her composure tested as never before when Julian was shown into their modest but respectable drawing-room, his tall frame somehow making the space feel smaller and more intimate, his formal courtesy toward her parents, impeccable, yet carrying an undercurrent of genuine nervousness that surprised her, as though he too understood the significance of this call and felt the weight of it. The tea was poured with Margaret's assistance, conversation navigated the safe waters of weather and London society, and Mrs. Hartley's hands trembled slightly with the teacup, until Mr. Hartley suggested with pointed courtesy that His Grace might enjoy seeing the garden, which, though modest, contained several specimens of unusual roses, and Eleanor understood this to be her father's way of granting them the privacy that propriety would normally forbid, a signal of provisional trust that both honored and unnerved her. They walked the narrow paths between autumn-faded blooms, the season's decline evident in browning edges and dropping petals, and Julian was silent for a long moment before he spoke with a rawness that suggested he had rehearsed these words, yet found them difficult. Nonetheless, my marriage to Catherine was arranged when I was 23 and she 20, a union of appropriate families and suitable fortunes, and we performed our duties to each other with perfect correctness for 7 years, producing an heir, maintaining our estates, presenting a united front to society. But Miss Hartley Eleanor, if I may, we barely knew each other, barely spoke beyond household necessities, and when she fell ill and died within a fortnight of fever, I felt grief for a life cut short, but also, God help me, a terrible relief at my freedom, and the guilt of that relief has haunted me ever since. Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him fully, seeing in his expression a vulnerability that cost him dearly to reveal, and she responded with the honesty he had offered her. I do not think you should feel guilt for acknowledging truth. Your Grace, surely it is worse to pretend emotions one does not feel than to admit the limitations of an arrangement. Neither of you chose freely, and it seems to me that you honored her with your fidelity and respect, which is more than many husbands offer even wives they claim to love. He looked at her with something approaching wonder, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of discovery. Do you know what I find most remarkable about you, Eleanor? You are content, genuinely content with the life you have built, despite society's judgment of it, and that contentment draws me more powerfully than any desperate pursuit ever could, for I have spent 3 years surrounded by women who saw only my title and my wealth, who would have said anything, become anything, to secure the position of Duchess, but you alone seem to neither need nor particularly want what I offer, and yet your company is what I find myself craving above all else. Crumbler, Eleanor felt her careful defenses crumbling under the weight of his sincerity, and she admitted with quiet vulnerability, I confess that I am not quite so content as I have convinced myself to be. Your Grace, I stopped hoping for marriage years ago because hope had become too painful to sustain, because every season brought fresh disappointment, and I learned that survival required me to want less, to expect less, to build a life from what was available rather than what I desired. But you have disrupted that careful equilibrium and awakened hopes I thought I had successfully buried, which frankly terrifies me more than I can adequately express." They stood in the fading light, surrounded by dying roses, two people who had learned to protect themselves from disappointment, and Julian reached for her hand with careful deliberation, holding it gently as though it was something precious and fragile, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of promise. "Then perhaps we might learn together to hope again, and to risk disappointment in pursuit of something genuine, for I find I am tired of safety and propriety, if they mean continuing to live only half a life." The weeks that followed unfolded like pages in a book Eleanor had never dared to read, each day adding another scene to a courtship that felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable. Drives through Hyde Park at the fashionable hour, when all of society could observe the Duke of Thorncliffe's unmistakable attention to Miss Eleanor Hartley, theatre performances where he secured a box and invited her family to join him, afternoon calls that stretched into early evening, as conversation ranged from politics to philosophy to literature, with an ease that made hours feel like moments, and through it all Eleanor felt the dangerous bloom of hope spreading through her chest like warmth after bitter cold. Though she tried desperately to maintain some measure of protective reserve, even as Julian's intentions grew increasingly transparent. It was an evening at Vauxhall Gardens, the pleasure grounds illuminated by thousands of lamps that turned the autumn night into something magical and otherworldly, and that Eleanor allowed herself to fully acknowledge what was building between them, for Julian had arranged a private supper box, and as they walked the lamplit paths afterward, he spoke with careful deliberation about the future, about his estates and the responsibilities he carried, about his desire not merely for a duchess to fulfill social obligations, but for a partner who would challenge his thinking and share in the work of managing his holdings. And Eleanor felt her heart beating so forcefully, she feared he must hear it as he continued. "I have spent 3 years in a sort of suspended existence, Miss Hartley, performing my duties but never truly living. And in these past weeks, you have awakened something in me, I had thought, permanently dormant. The desire not merely to survive each day, but to anticipate the next, to imagine a future that holds genuine contentment rather than mere obligation." Eleanor turned to face him in the lamplight, seeing in his expression an openness that suggested he was moments away from a declaration that would irrevocably alter both their lives, and she felt joy and terror in equal measure, the culmination of 9 years of disappointment, meeting the possibility of everything she had trained herself to stop wanting. But before Julian could continue his thought, a familiar voice cut through the magical atmosphere like a blade through silk. "Your Grace, what an extraordinary coincidence. I had no idea you would be here this evening, though of course everyone knows Vauxhall is simply crawling with the most common sort of people. Not at all the thing for someone of your distinction." Lady Cordelia Fairfax appeared on the path before them, as though conjured by malevolent magic, her beauty rendered almost sinister in the lamplight, and she was accompanied by her mother and 2 other young ladies, whose expressions suggested they had been thoroughly coached for this supposedly chance encounter. And before Eleanor could fully process what was happening, Cordelia had positioned herself between Eleanor and Julian with the skill of a general claiming strategic ground, her voice pitched to carry to the other evening strollers, who had begun to slow their pace to observe the confrontation. "I feel I must speak, Your Grace. Though it pains me deeply to be the bearer of such intelligence, but surely as your friend, I cannot allow you to be deceived by appearances. For there are those who whisper that Miss Hartley has employed rather calculating methods to secure your attention, that her performance of contentment and disinterest is merely that, a performance designed to intrigue a gentleman known to be weary of desperate pursuit, and I have it on good authority that she has been heard boasting to her sister of her clever strategy to capture a duke through reverse artifice, making you believe the pursuit was your idea, when all along she has been orchestrating every encounter with remarkable cunning." Eleanor felt the words strike like physical blows, the cruelty of them amplified by their public delivery and their calculated mixture of truth and distortion. For yes, she had discussed Julian with Margaret, had analyzed their conversations and acknowledged her growing feelings, but never with mercenary calculation, never with boastful strategy, and she saw Julian's expression shift from openness to that ducal reserve she had observed at their first meeting, saw him retreat behind the armor of his title and his caution, and in that moment Eleanor understood with devastating clarity that the fragile hope she had allowed herself to nurture was about to shatter against the rocks of his doubt and her own cursed fortune, that she had been a fool to imagine herself worthy of this happiness, that some women were simply destined to remain forever on the periphery, no matter how briefly they might glimpse the center, and the fairy tale evening dissolved into nightmare, as Julian offered his arm with terrible formality and said in a voice devoid of warmth, "Perhaps I should escort you home. Miss Hartley, the evening has grown rather late." The carriage ride back to the Hartley residence that evening passed in silence so complete it felt like a physical presence between them, Julian's formal posture and careful distance speaking more eloquently than words of his retreat behind ducal walls, and when he handed Eleanor down at her door, his farewell carried all the polite courtesy of a near stranger, and none of the warmth that had characterized their recent weeks together. His "Good evening," Miss Hartley landing like a death knell on hopes she should never have permitted herself to nurture, and Eleanor maintained her composure through sheer force of will, cultivated over 9 years of social disappointment, until she reached the safety of her bedchamber, where she finally allowed herself to acknowledge the devastating truth that she had been a fool, that women like her did not get fairy tale endings no matter how briefly they might glimpse the possibility, that Lady Cordelia's poison had found its mark in the fertile soil of Julian's caution and her own cursed fortune. Asterisk. Of course he doubted asterisk, she thought as she sat rigid in the darkness, still wearing her evening gown because the act of undressing felt beyond her capacity. Asterisk. Of course he believed there must be calculation behind my interest, for what else would explain a woman of 27, long resigned to spinsterhood, suddenly attracting a duke's attention except deliberate manipulation? I should have known better than to hope, should have maintained my walls instead of allowing him to dismantle them with his seemingly genuine regard. I should have remembered that men of his position do not marry women like me without suspecting ulterior motives, and now I am left more bereft than before because I foolishly allowed myself to imagine a different future asterisk. Days passed with no word from Thorncliffe, each silent morning confirming what Eleanor already knew in her bones, that whatever had been building between them had been crushed beneath the weight of societal doubt and his own wariness, and the whispers that reached her ears through Margaret's outraged reports told of the debutante's triumphant speculation that the Duke had finally recognized Miss Hartley's unsuitability, that he had been temporarily beguiled but had come to his senses, that surely he would now turn his attention to someone more appropriate, meaning younger, prettier, more malleable. Margaret raged on Eleanor's behalf with sisterly fury, calling Julian a coward and worse, demanding to know how he could abandon Eleanor after raising her hopes so deliberately, but Eleanor found she could not match her sister's anger, feeling instead only a bone-deep weariness and the bitter vindication of her original skepticism. "I knew it was too good to be true," she told Margaret quietly as they sat in the morning room on the 5th day of Julian's silence, autumn rain streaking the windows in patterns that matched the tears Eleanor refused to shed. "Women like me do not marry dukes, Meg. We watch from the periphery while younger, lovelier girls claim such prizes, and I was content with that reality until I allowed myself to forget it. But I shall not make that mistake again." She returned to her previous rhythms with determined deliberation, losing herself in household accounts and her mother's care, in charitable work among the parish, poor and books borrowed from the lending library, rebuilding the protective walls around her heart, brick by careful brick, and if she sometimes caught herself listening for the sound of his carriage or felt her pulse quicken at a knock on the door, only to feel the subsequent crushing disappointment, she told herself firmly that such reactions would fade with time, that she had survived disappointment before and would survive this too, and that dignity lay in accepting one's lot with grace rather than railing against immutable realities. But the truth that haunted her in the dark, hours before dawn, was that this loss felt different from all the others, that Julian had offered her not just position but partnership, had seemed to see and value the woman beneath society's dismissive labels, and losing that recognition hurt more than all 9 years of previous rejection combined. Julian Ashford sat in the leather chair of his study at Thorncliffe House, the rain that had persisted for 3 days, drumming against the windows in rhythms that matched the unquiet beating of his heart, and he acknowledged with bitter self-awareness that he had become the very thing he most despised. A man who allowed society's poison to corrupt his own judgment, who had retreated into ducal caution when he should have trusted what he knew in his bones to be true, that Eleanor Hartley possessed more genuine character in her smallest gesture than the entire assembly of matchmaking debutantes combined could manufacture in a lifetime of studied performance. Asterisk, what have I done? Asterisk, the question had haunted him through sleepless nights since that disastrous evening at Vauxhall, the memory of Eleanor's carefully maintained composure as he delivered that cold farewell burning like acid in his conscience, for he had seen the exact moment hope died behind her eyes, and he had been too much a coward to resurrect it, too caught in the old fears that had governed him since his first marriage, the terror of being deceived, of choosing wrongly, of binding himself to someone whose interest lay in his title rather than his person. And yet even as Lady Cordelia's accusations had fallen like poisoned arrows he had times known asterisk, that they rang false against everything he had learned of Eleanor's nature through their weeks of deepening acquaintance. On the morning of the 4th day of his self-imposed isolation, he summoned his man of affairs with a request that raised the efficient Mr. Pemberton's eyebrows but received no verbal question, for long service had taught him when his employer required discretion above curiosity. I need you to make inquiries careful, utterly discreet inquiries into the character and circumstances of Miss Eleanor Hartley of Bloomsbury, and more specifically into the source and veracity of certain rumors currently circulating regarding her conduct and motivations. The investigation that followed revealed truths that made Julian's shame deepen with the report. For Pemberton's careful questioning of servants, tradespeople, and charitable organization directors painted a portrait of a woman whose kindness operated as natural inclination rather than calculated performance. The modiste who reported Miss Hartley's habit of ordering simple gowns for herself while quietly commissioning and paying for wedding clothes for her shopgirls, the vicar of Street. Georges, who spoke with genuine warmth of Eleanor's work among the parish poor and her remarkable ability to organize practical assistance without a trace of condescending charity. The bookshop owner who described her voracious reading and their long discussions of literature, conducted with more insight than many university men could muster. And most damningly, the revelations about Lady Cordelia's orchestrated campaign of social destruction that had been observed by multiple witnesses but never checked because society preferred its cruelties wrapped in beautiful packages. Julian felt his anger building with each piece of intelligence, but the fury directed outward toward Lady Cordelia and her allies paled beside the rage he turned upon himself, for he had done to Eleanor exactly what society had done to him after his wife's death, made assumptions based on surface appearances rather than deeper truth, allowed fear to override knowledge, chosen protective caution over courageous trust, and in doing so, he had wounded someone who deserved nothing but reverence for the dignity with which she had faced years of unjust dismissal, and he knew with crystalline certainty that if he could not find a way to win back her regard, he would spend the rest of his days mourning not what might have been, but what he had deliberately destroyed through his own weakness and doubt. Julian Ashford arrived at the Fairfax ball on the 7th evening after his retreat with a purpose that burned cold and clear as winter starlight, his expression carrying such arctic displeasure that the assembled guests instinctively made way for his passage through the glittering rooms, and when his gaze found Lady Cordelia holding court among her admirers near the refreshment table, her triumphant smile faltered at whatever she read in his face. For dukes did not often attend minor social events, and his presence tonight carried the weight of deliberate intention rather than casual entertainment. He approached with the predatory grace that had made men wary of him in business negotiations, and the sudden hush that fell over Cordelia's circle spoke to society's instinct for witnessing public destruction when a powerful man chose to deliver it. "Lady Cordelia," he said with a courtesy so glacial it constituted insult, "I find I must thank you for your recent concern regarding Miss Hartley's character, as your efforts to enlighten me prompted the most thorough investigation into reputation and conduct. Not Miss Hartley's, as you might assume, but rather into the sources and motivations behind the remarkable campaign of slander that has been waged against a woman whose character, I have discovered through exhaustive inquiry, is beyond reproach, whereas the character of those who would destroy her through deliberate falsehood reveals depths of cruelty and calculation that I find distasteful in the extreme." The words fell like stones into still water, their ripples spreading through the ballroom as those nearby strained to hear, and Cordelia's face went from flushed pink to chalk white as she understood that her machinations had been not only discovered, but were being publicly exposed by the very man she had sought to manipulate. Julian continued with merciless precision. "I would advise you and your associates to direct your considerable energies toward more worthy pursuits than the persecution of your betters, as I have no tolerance for such behavior, and my memory for those who engage in it is remarkably long." And with that pronouncement, he turned his back on her, the cut direct delivered before witnesses, and made his way to his host, to deliver another carefully calculated statement. Lord Fairfax received the Duke's announcement with visible consternation. Julian would be withdrawing from London society for the foreseeable future to attend to pressing estate matters, would not be available for social engagements, and hoped his absence would not cause undue disappointment, though he suspected the season's determined debutantes would find other objects for their attentions. The message spread through the assembly within minutes the Duke was removing himself from the marriage market, and those who had pinned their hopes on capturing his title would need to redirect their ambitions. But Julian cared nothing for their disappointment, his mind already focused on the far more important and delicate task that awaited him. The following morning found him in the modest study of Mr. Robert Hartley, Eleanor's father, a gentleman of comfortable but unremarkable means, whose shrewd eyes assessed the Duke with the wariness of a man who had watched his daughter's heart break too many times to trust easily in aristocratic favor. "Your Grace," Hartley said with careful formality after they had exchanged preliminary courtesies, "I confess myself surprised by this call, given that we have heard nothing from Thorncliffe for well over a week, during which time my daughter has endured fresh whispers and speculation about your apparent withdrawal of interest." Julian accepted the rebuke as his due, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "I have no excuse that makes my conduct acceptable, sir, only an explanation that reveals my weakness. I allowed doubt to override knowledge, fear to corrupt judgment, and in doing so I wounded someone who deserved only my protection and regard. But I have spent this past week establishing beyond any question the truth I should have trusted from the beginning, that your daughter possesses character and integrity that make her worthy of far better than I can offer, yet I am selfish enough to hope she might forgive my temporary blindness and allow me the honor of formal courtship with the intention of marriage, if she will have me." The words hung between them, raw with honesty, and after a long moment, Hartley's expression softened slightly. "The question is not whether I will grant permission, Your Grace, but whether Eleanor will grant forgiveness, for she has borne disappointment with grace her entire adult life. But this latest wound cut deeper than most, and if you seek to court my daughter, you must understand that her dignity is not weakness, and her patience is not infinite. She deserves certainty, not vacillation, and commitment, not continued doubt." Julian nodded, feeling the weight of judgment and finding it perfectly just. "I understand, sir, and I can offer her both certainty and commitment, for I know now without question that she is precisely the partner I need and far more than I deserve. And if she will allow me the opportunity, I intend to spend the rest of my days proving myself worthy of the gift of her regard." As he left the Hartley residence with permission reluctantly granted, and the understanding that Eleanor's consent mattered infinitely more than her father's, Julian felt his heart beating with a mixture of hope and trepidation, knowing that the next and most crucial step required not careful planning but raw courage, the willingness to stand before Eleanor with his heart undefended, and trust that the woman who had shown him glimpses of genuine partnership might find it within herself to risk believing in him once more. The storm broke over London with the fury of something long gathering, the afternoon sky turning bruised and violet as Julian Ashford's carriage clattered through streets already running with rain, and he knew the weather matched perfectly the turbulence of what he was about to attempt, arriving unannounced at Eleanor's home with neither careful planning nor proper notice, driven by the recognition that some things could not wait upon society's tedious protocols, and that if he delayed even another day he risked losing forever what he had been fool enough to nearly destroy through his own cowardice and doubt. The Hartley butler's expression, when he opened the door to find a rain-soaked Duke demanding entrance, spoke volumes about the household's protective fury on Eleanor's behalf. But Julian's determination must have shown clearly enough that after a moment's hesitation, the servant allowed him into the entrance hall, with instructions to wait while he inquired whether Miss Hartley would receive him, the phrasing itself, a subtle rebuke, since proper young ladies did not refuse dukes, except when dukes had forfeited their right to automatic courtesy. When Eleanor entered the small parlour where he had been directed, she was pale but composed, her dove-grey morning dress emphasizing the dignity that had first captured his attention, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other across the rain-shadowed room before she spoke with a quietness that somehow cut deeper than shouting, "Your Grace, I confess myself surprised by this visit, as I had understood from your previous farewell that our acquaintance had run its natural course." The formal words landed like blows, and Julian felt them as he deserved, but he also heard beneath them the tremor of genuine hurt, and suddenly all his carefully rehearsed speeches dissolved into raw truth. "I was wrong. Eleanor, I was a coward and a fool, and I wounded you through my own weakness, allowing old fears and society's poison to corrupt what I knew in my heart to be true. That you are the most genuine person I have ever encountered, and that losing you would be the greatest mistake of my life." Her composure cracked then, not into the forgiveness he hoped for, but into anger he had never seen from her, the fury of someone who had maintained dignity through years of dismissal, and could no longer contain the accumulated weight of being treated as though her feelings were inconsequential. "You treated me exactly as the debutantes have done, Your Grace, as though I were a thing whose value fluctuates according to others' opinions, rather than a person with a heart that breaks like any other, and you have no idea, you cannot possibly understand what it costs to hope at my age, to lower the walls built through years of disappointment, only to have those hopes confirmed as foolish, when someone who seemed different proves himself exactly the same as all the rest." Julian moved toward her then, heedless of propriety, desperate to make her understand. "You are absolutely right, and I have no defense except that I was terrified of choosing wrongly again, of binding myself to someone who wanted my title rather than my person, but the investigation I conducted these past weeks revealed only what I should have trusted from the beginning, that you are incapable of the deception I feared, that every good thing I believed about you is true and more than true, and yes, you deserve far better than me, but I am selfish enough to ask anyway, to beg if necessary, and for another chance to prove that I can be worthy of your regard." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that she had not shed during their separation, and years of controlled emotion finally breaching the careful walls she had built, and her voice when she spoke was raw with pain and hope warring within her. "How can I trust this, Julian? How can I risk believing again when you have already shown me that your certainty wavers, that you will retreat when society whispers its doubts?" He closed the remaining distance between them, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that contradicted the intensity burning in his eyes. "Because I know now, with absolute clarity, that the only opinion that matters is my own judgment of your character, and that judgment is unshakable. You are brave and kind and brilliant and real, in a world of calculated performances, and I would rather face society's censure with you beside me than have its approval with anyone else." The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows of the small parlour, but neither of them noticed when Julian drew Eleanor into his arms, and she allowed herself to soften against him, her tears dampening his already rain-soaked coat as he murmured apologies and promises into her hair, and when he finally tilted her face up to his and kissed her with a reverence that spoke of worship rather than mere desire, tasting salt and rain and forgiveness on her lips, Eleanor felt something fundamental shift within her, not the death of caution but the rebirth of courage, the willingness to risk her heart one final time on the belief that this man, flawed and human and real, might actually be worth the gamble of hope she had thought herself too old and too wise to make again. The weeks following their reconciliation unfolded with the deliberate grace of spring arriving after a harsh winter. Julian's courtship of Eleanor now conducted with such unmistakable seriousness of purpose that even society's most determined gossips could find no room for speculation about his intentions, and where before he had been careful to maintain ducal reserve, he now showed a devotion so public and unwavering that the ton was forced to recalibrate its collective understanding of Miss Eleanor Hartley's value, what had been mockery, transforming gradually into grudging respect as the undeniable reality of the Duke of Thorncliffe's genuine regard became impossible to dismiss or explain away through the comfortable fiction that she had somehow entrapped him through manipulation. They were seen together everywhere, driving in Hyde Park at the fashionable hour, with Julian's attention focused entirely on Eleanor rather than acknowledging the bows and curtsies directed at them from passing carriages. Attending the theatre, where he sat beside her in his private box and leaned close to share observations that made her laugh with unguarded delight. Walking through the galleries at Somerset House, discussing paintings with the easy discourse of intellectual equals, and always his manner toward her communicated something that transcended mere courtship and spoke, instead of partnership, of a man who had found not just a potential wife, but the person whose counsel he sought, and whose presence completed something fundamental within him. Eleanor bloomed under this steady regard, not through any change in her appearance, but through a radiance that came from allowing her happiness to show without the protective walls she had maintained for so many years, and Julian found himself fascinated by the transformation, not because she became someone different, but because she became more fully herself, her natural warmth and intelligence no longer tempered by defensive caution, but expressed with growing confidence, as she learned to trust that his devotion would not waver again, regardless of society's whispers or his own momentary doubts. Their conversations during these weeks deepened beyond the careful courtship discourse they had maintained before his retreat, touching now on the practical realities of the life they both understood they would build together. Eleanor's firm insistence that marriage would not require her to abandon the charitable works that had given purpose to her unmarried years, Julian's equally firm assertion that he wanted not just her companionship, but her active counsel in the management of his various estates, for he had observed her capable administration of her father's household accounts, recognized in her a mind suited to the complexities of stewardship, discussions of children that acknowledged both his young daughter from his first marriage, who would need a mother's patient guidance, and the children they might have together if they were blessed with such fortune, and always the underlying commitment to building something based on genuine partnership, rather than the hierarchical arrangement that characterized most aristocratic marriages, where wives existed as ornamental additions to their husbands' lives, rather than as integral participants in shared endeavors. Margaret Hartley watched her sister's courtship with joy so visible it sometimes brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, for her younger sister had been fierce in her defense during the dark weeks of Julian's absence, and her relief at Eleanor's happiness now manifested in enthusiastic participation in all the preparations and planning that accompanied a serious courtship, though both sisters were careful never to speak prematurely of outcomes not yet formally decided, even as everyone who observed the Duke and Eleanor together understood with perfect clarity that a proposal was not a question of if, but merely of when, and that when it came, it would represent not a surprising development, but rather the inevitable conclusion of a connection that had survived doubt and separation to emerge stronger and more certain than most courtships that proceeded along smoother paths, without the testing that revealed whether feeling could withstand the pressures that real life would inevitably bring. Julian chose the library for his proposal with deliberate intention, understanding that grand gestures in ballrooms or gardens might dazzle, but this quiet room lined with books represented something more essential about what they had built together, a connection forged through genuine discourse rather than romantic spectacle, through meeting of minds before meeting of hearts. And when he asked Eleanor to meet him there on a golden afternoon in late spring, she came with a knowing stillness that suggested she understood what was approaching, even as her carefully maintained composure revealed nothing of whether her answer would grant him the future he had come to desire, more than he had thought himself capable of wanting anything after years of emotional winter following his first wife's death. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like suspended snow, and Eleanor stood near the shelf where they had first truly conversed weeks ago, though it felt like both yesterday and a lifetime past, and Julian found himself momentarily unable to speak as he looked at her, not beautiful by society's narrow standards, but possessing something infinitely more valuable, a quality of realness that made every other woman he had ever known seem like pale sketches compared to her full rendering. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the ducal authority he wielded in Parliament or estate management, but instead held a vulnerability he had shown to no one else. "Eleanor, I have rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in my mind, and every pretty speech I prepared seems inadequate now that you stand before me. So I will offer you only truth. You do not need me. You have built a full and purposeful life without marriage. You are complete unto yourself in ways that society refuses to recognize, but which I see with perfect clarity, and yet I am selfish enough to ask you to choose me anyway, to choose to build something together, not because you require rescuing from spinsterhood or I need an ornamental duchess, but because we have found in each other something rare and worth nurturing into whatever future we can create through partnership and patience and genuine regard." He withdrew from his pocket a small velvet box containing the ring that had belonged to his grandmother, deliberately chosen rather than the one his first wife had worn, for this needed to symbolize new beginning rather than continuation of what had been. And Eleanor's eyes widened slightly as she recognized the significance of that choice. "I am asking you to be my wife," Julian continued, moving closer but not yet touching her, for this decision needed to be made freely without the persuasion of physical proximity. "Not because I need an heir or require someone to manage my households or wish to silence society's expectations, but because in you I have found an intellectual equal and a moral compass, and a person whose presence makes me want to be better than I am, and because I hope that, together, we might build something that honors both our individualities, while creating a partnership that neither of us could construct alone." Eleanor's composure finally cracked, not into tears but into a smile of such complicated emotion that Julian felt his heart constrict with the recognition of all it contained. Hope warring with protective caution, joy tempered by remembered pain, the courage required to risk vulnerability after years of necessary self-sufficiency. When she spoke, her voice trembled slightly but held steady. "Yes, Julian, yes, I am terrified and hopeful, and perhaps slightly mad for believing this can be real. But yes, I choose you, and I choose this, and I choose to believe that what we have found together is strong enough to weather whatever challenges will come, because nothing worthwhile is ever built without risk, and you are worth the gamble of my carefully guarded heart." The embrace that followed promised partnership before passion, respect alongside desire, and when Julian slipped his grandmother's ring onto Eleanor's finger, they both understood. They were binding themselves not just to each other, but to the shared work of building a marriage that would defy society's shallow expectations through the radical act of genuine equality and mutual regard. And within the hour they had descended to the drawing room, where her parents waited with barely concealed anxiety that transformed into joy and relief, when Julian formally announced their engagement and asked for their blessing, which was given with her father's firm handshake and her mother's tears that spoke of years of worry finally released into the hopeful future that even she had stopped believing possible for her eldest daughter. The formal announcement of the Duke of Thorncliffe's engagement to Miss Eleanor Hartley appeared in the Morning Post 3 days after his proposal. The brief notice, conveying only the essential facts, yet sending ripples through London society that manifested in reactions as varied as the individuals who comprised the Tun's complex social hierarchy. Genuine happiness from the few, true friends Eleanor had cultivated during her years on the periphery of ballroom life, forced congratulations delivered through gritted teeth by those who had dismissed her as negligible and now found themselves required to acknowledge her elevation to one of England's highest ranks, and cold fury from Lady Cordelia Fairfax, who received the news while taking breakfast with her mother, and whose violent reaction sent a teacup shattering against the morning-room wall in a display of temper that confirmed everything Julian had recognized about her calculated cruelty during his investigation into the campaign she had waged against Eleanor's character. The subsequent days brought a deluge of morning callers to the Hartley residence, Eleanor suddenly finding herself the recipient of attention from ladies who had previously looked through her as though she were invisible. Their insincere effusions about having always known she possessed special qualities, ringing hollow to someone who remembered with perfect clarity every slight and dismissal she had endured over 9 long seasons of being systematically overlooked, and she navigated these visits with the same quiet dignity that had sustained her through years of social marginalization. Though now she possessed the additional armor of Julian's steady presence, for he made a point of calling each afternoon and sitting beside her in the drawing room with a protectiveness that communicated clearly to even the most obtuse observer that any insult to his future Duchess would be considered a personal affront to the Duke himself. The most challenging aspect of this sudden social transformation was not the false friendships offered by opportunists seeking connection to ducal influence, but rather Eleanor's internal navigation of her changed circumstances, the cognitive dissonance of being simultaneously the same person she had been weeks ago, yet suddenly deemed worthy of notice solely because a man of rank had recognized value that had existed all along, and she found herself wrestling with complicated emotions about accepting accolades for qualities that had gone unacknowledged until Julian's attention rendered them visible to eyes that had been willfully blind to anything that did not fit society's narrow definition of feminine worth. The engagement ball at Thorncliffe House, 3 weeks after the announcement, marked Eleanor's formal introduction to society as the future Duchess, and she entered the magnificent ballroom on Julian's arm, wearing a gown of pale gold silk that had been created by London's finest modiste, with none of the apologetic simplicity that had characterized her previous attire, for Julian had gently insisted that she need no longer dress to avoid notice, but could instead claim the elegance that suited her position, and as they opened the dancing together with all eyes upon them, Eleanor experienced a moment of crystalline clarity. She belonged in this glittering space, not because Julian had chosen her, and thereby conferred belonging through his rank, but because she had never stopped being worthy of it, regardless of whether society's shallow gaze had been capable of recognizing that worth, and this realization brought her the first joy entirely without reservation or protective caution that she had allowed herself, since Julian had first approached her across a different ballroom weeks ago when her life had been circumscribed by diminished expectations and carefully managed disappointment. And now, as she moved through the figures of the dance with the man who would become her husband, she finally permitted herself to believe that happiness might be something she could claim without waiting for it to be revoked by cruel fortune or society's capricious judgment. The months between engagement and wedding unfolded with a deliberateness that Eleanor insisted upon despite Julian's willingness to arrange a grand ceremony befitting his ducal status, for she had spent too many years watching elaborate society, weddings that celebrated spectacle over substance, and she wished their union to be marked by elegant simplicity rather than ostentatious display, and after initial resistance, Julian came to understand that this preference reflected not lack of confidence in her new position, but rather a desire to begin their marriage with authenticity rather than performance, so they settled upon a compromise that would honor his rank through the ceremony's location in the chapel at Thorncliffe Estate, while maintaining an intimacy that spoke to the genuine nature of what they were building together. The preparations included several visits to Julian's various estates, each journey revealing new dimensions of the life Eleanor would inhabit as his Duchess, and it was during these travels that Julian observed with growing wonder how naturally she moved among his tenants and staff, not with the condescension of noblesse oblige, but with genuine interest in their lives and concerns, asking questions that revealed her quick understanding of estate management complexities and offering observations that demonstrated an intuitive grasp of the human dynamics that determined whether communities thrived or merely survived, and he found himself consulting her perspective on matters he had previously managed alone, discovering that her years of running her parents' modest household had equipped her with practical wisdom that complemented his formal education in ways that made their partnership stronger than either could be individually. The most delicate aspect of these preparatory months involved Eleanor's developing relationship with Julian's daughter, Catherine, a solemn child of 6 who had barely known her mother and now regarded this new woman in her father's life with wary uncertainty that Eleanor recognized as requiring patience rather than forced affection, so she approached the little girl with the same respect she wished society had granted her during her years of dismissal, never demanding embraces or protestations of love, but instead offering quiet companionship during afternoon walks through Thorncliffe's gardens and gentle conversations about the books Catherine was learning to read, and slowly, incrementally, the child's reserve began to thaw in the presence of someone who treated her as a person worthy of consideration rather than an obligation to be managed. During quiet evenings when Eleanor and Julian sat together planning their future, they spoke with careful honesty about his first marriage, neither avoiding the topic nor allowing it to cast shadows over what they were creating, for Julian understood that honoring the past did not require being imprisoned by it, and Eleanor possessed enough security in what they shared to acknowledge that his late wife had been a real person who deserved respectful memory even as they built something entirely new together. And in these conversations they discussed the family. They might create children who would grow up witnessing a partnership between parents rather than merely cordial arrangement, a household that valued character over social performance, a legacy that extended beyond title and wealth to encompass the harder work of building genuine connection and moral purpose. And as autumn began to paint the countryside in shades of amber and gold, they both felt the approaching wedding not as an ending to courtship, but as the formal beginning of a life they had been constructing through accumulated small moments of trust and vulnerability, and choosing to believe that love, which grew slowly from friendship and respect, might prove more durable than passion that flared bright and burned quickly away. The wedding took place on an October afternoon when autumn had reached its fullest glory, and Thorncliffe Estate lay bathed in golden light that seemed to bless the union with nature's own benediction. The chapel's ancient stones warm beneath sunshine that streamed through stained glass windows to paint the gathered witnesses in jeweled hues of amber and crimson and sapphire, and Eleanor moved down the aisle on her father's arm, wearing a gown of elegant ivory silk that had been fashioned without the fussy embellishments meant to disguise age or create illusions of youth, for she no longer sought to apologize for her 27 years, but instead claimed them as evidence of the character and resilience that had brought her to this moment, and the confidence that radiated from her as she approached Julian, waiting at the altar, rendered her magnificent in ways that had nothing to do with conventional beauty, and everything to do with a woman who had finally allowed herself to believe in her own worth regardless of society's belated recognition of it. Julian watched his bride approach with an expression of such unguarded emotion that several guests who had known him during his cold years of mourning found themselves unexpectedly moved by the transformation visible in a man who had seemed permanently encased in ducal reserve. And when Eleanor reached his side and placed her hand in his, the rightness of their joining seemed to settle over the chapel like a palpable blessing, and the vows they exchanged carried weight beyond the traditional words. For Julian had insisted on adding his own promises that spoke of partnership and respect, and choosing her not just in this moment, but in every moment to come, his voice steady but threaded with feeling as he pledged before God and these witnesses to honor the woman she was, rather than attempting to shape her into some imagined ideal, and Eleanor's own vows trembled with the vulnerability of someone who had guarded her heart for so long that its full opening required courage she had not known she possessed until this man had proven himself worthy of the risk. Margaret stood as her sister's attendant, her face wet with happy tears that reflected the journey they had both traveled from that first ball where Eleanor had stood in dove-grey silk, accepting her invisibility to this moment of transformation, and when the vicar pronounced Julian and Eleanor husband and wife, and the Duke of Thorncliffe kissed his new duchess with tender reverence, the assembled guests erupted in applause that acknowledged not just the union of two people, but the triumph of substance over superficiality. And as the newly married couple processed back down the aisle together, Eleanor caught sight of several young women sitting quietly at the edges of the congregation wallflowers, who had likely attended, hoping to witness the impossible becoming possible, and she smiled at them with a warmth that conveyed understanding and encouragement, a silent message that their time would come if they could maintain faith in their own value through the years of being overlooked. The wedding breakfast that followed offered celebration without ostentation, the intimate gathering of family and true friends sharing in joy that felt earned rather than merely performed, and during a quiet moment when Julian drew Eleanor away from the festivities to a windowed alcove overlooking the gardens, they stood together, acknowledging without words the improbable path that had led from that first dance to this beginning, and as their carriage departed for the wedding journey that would take them through the Lake District, the guests who remained behind spoke in tones of admiration, rather than the mockery that had once accompanied Eleanor's name, the whispers now celebrating a love story that had unfolded according to its own timing rather than society's arbitrary schedule, proving that the best things sometimes come to those who wait with dignity intact and hope carefully preserved against the day when it might finally be warranted. Their wedding night unfolded with a tenderness that neither had anticipated fully, for Eleanor had spent years imagining herself permanently excluded from such intimacies, and Julian had known only duty in his first marriage. Yet here, in the candlelit chamber of the Lake District Inn, where they had stopped for their first night as husband and wife, they discovered that vulnerability shared between two people who had chosen each other with full awareness created a profound intimacy that transcended mere physical joining. And as Julian helped Eleanor from her traveling dress with hands that trembled slightly, despite his aristocratic composure, she found herself unafraid, because this man had proven himself worthy of her trust through months of patient courtship that honored her intelligence and character rather than simply pursuing her person. And when he paused to cup her face in his palms and ask with quiet earnestness if she was certain, if she wished to proceed, giving her permission to set their pace even now, she felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, because no one in her 27 years had ever granted her such agency in matters that concerned her own body and heart. And she answered him not with words, but by reaching up to loosen his cravat with fingers that gained confidence as she proceeded. And what passed between them in the hours that followed was neither the awkward fumbling of complete innocence nor the practiced efficiency of routine, but rather the gradual discovery of how two people might learn each other's desires and boundaries through attention and care and the willingness to be uncertain together, building pleasure from patience rather than demanding it, arrive fully formed. The weeks that followed carried them through the Lake District's misty valleys and then southward toward Italy, where autumn yielded to a gentler season, and they wandered through Florence's galleries and Venice's winding canals, discovering joy neither had believed themselves capable of experiencing, and the letters Eleanor wrote to Margaret overflowed with observations about art and architecture, but also with barely contained happiness that her sister recognized as evidence of a marriage that was everything their parents, a generation, claimed impossible to achieve in unions, based on genuine feeling rather than practical arrangement. And Julian found himself laughing again, a sound that surprised him each time it emerged spontaneously in response to Eleanor's dry wit or her unexpected delight in the small pleasures of travel. And he realized that his first marriage's absence of passion had taught him to believe himself incapable of such feeling, when in truth he had simply never found the right person to awaken it until this woman whom society had dismissed as too old and too plain proved herself to be exactly what his careful heart required. Their return to London for the little season revealed how completely Eleanor's position had transformed, for she entered ballrooms now as the Duchess of Thorncliffe and navigated her new status with the same grace that had sustained her through years of dismissal, neither seeking revenge against those who had mocked her, nor pretending that their previous cruelty had not occurred, and she devoted herself to expanding the charitable works she had quietly maintained during her years of spinsterhood, now possessing the resources to establish schools for tenant children and workshops where women might learn trades that offered alternatives to servitude, or worse. And Julian's contentment was visible to all who observed how the formerly cold Duke watched his wife with undisguised admiration and consulted her opinion on estate matters with genuine respect for her judgment, and the debutantes of the new season regarded the Duchess with a mixture of envy and dawning comprehension that perhaps the frantic pursuit of title and fortune might matter less than the cultivation of character that could attract a partner rather than simply securing a position. And Eleanor occasionally caught sight of young women watching her with expressions that reminded her of her former self, and she made certain to engage them in conversation, offering the acknowledgement and respect she had once desperately needed, planting seeds that might sustain them through their own seasons of being overlooked until their particular worthiness found its proper recognition. 2 years had passed since Eleanor Hartley became the Duchess of Thorncliffe, and on an April evening when the London season had reached its glittering height, she found herself once again at the Ashworth Ball, where her extraordinary journey had begun. Though now she entered through the main receiving line on her husband's arm, rather than slipping quietly through side doors, hoping to avoid notice. And as they descended the marble staircase into the ballroom, she experienced a moment of profound vertigo at the completeness of the circle her life had traced. For the same chandeliers cast their golden light over the same polished floors where she had once stood in dove-grey silk, accepting her invisibility. Yet everything had transformed not through any alteration in the physical space, but through the complete revolution of her position within it. And she wore emerald silk tonight that complimented rather than apologized for her 29 years, and moved with the quiet confidence of a woman who had finally internalized what Julian had recognized from the beginning, that her worth had never depended on society's recognition of it, but had existed all along, waiting only for her own acceptance and the right person's appreciation. Yet despite the security of her position, Eleanor found her gaze drawn not to the swirl of dancers at the ballroom's center, but to its periphery, where she spotted a young woman of perhaps 23, sitting with rigid dignity in a chair against the wall, her gown a serviceable blue rather than the fashionable pastels favored by wealthier debutantes. And Eleanor recognized in the woman's carefully composed expression the same protective armor she herself had once worn, the same determination to maintain dignity while being systematically overlooked, and without conscious decision, she found herself moving toward that quiet corner, aware of Julian's understanding, squeeze of her hand before he released her to circulate among the gentlemen, and when Eleanor approached the young woman and introduced herself by name rather than title, the surprise that flickered across those guarded features reminded her viscerally of how rare it was for women of rank to acknowledge those society had deemed unimportant, and she settled into the adjacent chair and asked with genuine interest about the woman's reading preferences, her thoughts on the art exhibition currently drawing crowds, her opinions on matters of substance rather than the empty pleasantries usually offered to wallflowers. And as their conversation deepened, Eleanor noticed several other young women watching with expressions of tentative hope, and she made mental note to ensure each of them received similar attention before the evening ended, for she understood now that her position carried responsibilities beyond managing estates and hosting political dinners. It offered the opportunity to extend to others the recognition and respect that might sustain them through their own seasons of being dismissed until their particular worthiness found its proper audience. Julian watched his wife from across the ballroom with an expression of such open adoration that several gentlemen teased him about his continued honeymoon behavior, despite 2 years of marriage, and he accepted their ribbing with good humor because he felt no embarrassment about his devotion to Eleanor, whose intelligence and compassion had proven themselves essential to both his happiness and his effectiveness as a landowner, for she had transformed Thorncliffe's management through innovations in tenant welfare and education that had increased both productivity and loyalty, and her counsel on matters ranging from agricultural improvements to political positioning had demonstrated a strategic mind that matched his own, and when she caught his eye across the room and placed a subtle hand on her still flat abdomen in the private signal they had developed to share the secret they had confirmed. Only that morning that she carried their first child, his joy was so complete and unexpected that he found himself blinking against moisture that a duke was not supposed to display in public, and he moved toward her with purpose that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the profound need to be near the woman who had taught him that the best things in life came not from pursuing what society deemed valuable and from recognizing worth that others overlooked. And when he reached her side and she introduced him to Miss Patricia Winters, a vicar's daughter in her 4th unsuccessful season, he engaged the young woman with the same respectful attention he offered to peers and politicians, following Eleanor's example in demonstrating through action that character mattered more than circumstance. And as the evening progressed and they moved through the ballroom together, stopping frequently to include those whom others ignored, they created ripples of inclusion that would not change society overnight, but planted seeds of different values in soil that might eventually prove fertile. And in the carriage ride home through London's lamplit streets, Julian held Eleanor's hand and spoke quietly about his hopes for their child and his gratitude for the life they had built together, a partnership that had exceeded anything his younger self had imagined possible, and proved that the best marriages were not those arranged by parents or driven by desperation, but those that grew from genuine recognition of another person's full humanity. And Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, feeling the deep contentment that came from knowing herself fully seen and valued, not despite her years and her independence, but because of them, the proof that dignity maintained and hope carefully preserved could indeed be rewarded when the right person finally appeared.